So today I would like to talk a bit more about something more specific, historically speaking, and I would like to start from the Middle Ages, which, as the most perceptive of you surely have understood to be my, not really my greatest passion in absolute terms, but let's say the era on which I am better informed on. So let's say that I can provide something more meaningful about it more easily. And specifically speaking, I would like to talk a little bit about the Norman conquest of Sicily. Now, this is a huge topic indeed, for the simple reason that obviously it was an epochal event. I am surprised sometimes how on the internet, when there are people passionate about Normans, especially in the Anglo-Saxon audience, many are even surprised that the Normans conquered Sicily, and they don't have a very clear idea of how it happened, how to compare it with the Norman conquest of England. I will discuss that in the future. I originally intended to make this video about a comparison between the Norman conquest of Sicily and the one of England, that in this chronological order, in fact. However, today I would like really to talk about the significance of the conquest of Sicily, not just of southern Italy, because the Normans, before conquering Sicily, had actually conquered already large parts of southern Italy, had already entered into the political play, let's say, of the political game of the Italian peninsula. But conquest of Sicily stands really as an event of its own. First of all, the conquest began in 1061, and it had been begun by Robert and his of Hauteville, which was the Norman family, the Norman, which eventually came the Norman dynasty ruling in the kingdom of Sicily, and his brother Roger, which would have eventually become the great count of Sicily. Roger the First, as such, because Robert had died before his brother, before the conquest of the island was concluded, and therefore Roger eventually became the great count of Sicily. This was a title that had been granted by the Pope to the Norman family of the Hauteville, even before that they actually conquered Sicily, meaning when Sicily was still in the hands of the Arabs. And the conquest of Sicily took 30 years. It was a complex process, obviously, not just because of the length, as you can imagine, but because Sicily was not probably such an homogeneous place to conquer. Telling the truth, it was a very progressive conquest. Also a very methodical one, probably. The Normans really stopped in front of each fort, of each castle, and took it one after another. We won't talk about a strictly military conquest of Sicily. Let's talk a bit about what were consequences of this. Well, first of all, as we said, Sicily was in the hands of the Arabs. So what happened with the Norman conquering Sicily? On the Pope's account, we can say, was obviously the Christianization of the island. So many Muslims emigrated en masse from Sicily. They came back to Tunisia, most of whom had came from, at least not the single people, but originally speaking, the Arabs, if we can call them Arabs, maybe just linguistically, because most of the ones that had conquered Sicily in the previous centuries had been Berbers, with a sort of Arabicized elite, and they weren't really Arabs proper, from an ethnical point of view. However, this emigration was not complete. There were obviously groups remaining in the island, groups of Muslims inhabiting the island after the Norman conquest. And their fate was overall positive considering the standards of the time, because you have to think that the Normans actually made a large employ of Muslims in their administration, and even in their army. They had certain special corps that had particular importance into the Norman armed forces. However, the majority of Muslims actually became serfs, and not because they were Muslims really, but just because the Norman feudal system that had been imported in Sicily after they had been conquered, like it had happened anywhere else, it had been exported, just like it would have happened in England, or how, I don't know, in other places where the vassalitic system had spread. It brought to social certification. Sicily had not seen that. Arab Sicily didn't know any form of that, which was also weakness, politically speaking, because there were lots of small properties from which, over the centuries, basically many little powers had emerged. And this fragmentation was one of the causes why it was so easy to conquer Sicily for the Normans. So what happened to many Muslims that remained in Sicily is that they became serfs in the latifundia of the new Norman lords. And not only of lords, because this social system obviously was a fully Christian one, independently from the fact that within the same Christians in Italy, in Sicily, and in southern Italy, there were also Greek Orthodox Christians, together with the Catholics one. But there were a lot of monasteries in Sicily. Some of the most important are really important for the history of the Orthodox Church, and they are in Sicily, and therefore they became maybe serfs of those monasteries, which were obviously endowed with new lands by the Norman kings. However, Arab culture wasn't really weakened by this. Let's say that the flourishing of Arab art and literature, poetry, think about that, had not stopped during the decline of Arab Sicily that had happened before the Norman conquest, and not even after the Norman conquest. On the contrary, we can say that it's exactly under the Norman rule that the Arab influence had its greatest cultural influx. Think that in Sicily today there is basically nothing strictly, in terms of architecture, for instance, coming from the Arab times. They didn't build anything, or what was built was reconverted in a way or another, because there wasn't, probably a huge center that could, or better, a huge authority that could draw a lot of resources from the whole island and building in a concentrated place. So even if Palermo, which was the capital of Sicily during Arab rule, was a very large city at the time, not like Baghdad or Damascus or Cordoba, but seemingly, especially, had a great demographical strength, but it didn't leave structures that we can still see today. Most of them were reconverted, like the the cathedral of Palermo, which was originally a mosque, but we have just a very a very poor and highly hypothetical idea of how it could be. And instead, it's under the Normans that we have the best Arab influences. We have a lot of Arab artists, and especially think of the mosaics and sculpture and so on that worked for building churches. And Sicily has beautiful architecture from the Norman period that also benefited highly from this um, from this Arab influence. And also in science, Arab influence was extremely important. We can say that the Normans were, let's say, a bit rough, when they came from Normandy and taking power in Italy and so on. And when they built up a monarchy in Sicily, as we will see in a while, they had to build a court, and therefore they had a centralized government, and they had a certain idea of power and concept of knowledge. And Arab scientific texts that obviously had come also in the case of the Arabs from copying the old Hellenistic manuscripts and knowledge in general highly enriched the Latin Norman culture. Mm. And and we can say that the Kingdom of Sicily in this sense was one of the most technologically advanced at the time. However, probably the most important thing about the conquest of Sicily in this sense is the unification of southern Italy under a unique sovereign. Southern Italy, differently from what had happened in the north, basically from the times the Byzantines had lost certain areas to the Longobards, had never been unified. It had been substantially divided into many principalities, and duchies, and territories. Many Byzantine territories had had gained a sort of autonomy and basically independence. Then the Arabs came. Then the Byzantines had reconquered, but that there had never been a complete unification of southern Italy and Sicily attached. But for dynastic reasons and inheritance, is in 1130 we can say that the Kingdom of Sicily was probably born, and it was born with the unification of Sicily that passed from county to kingdom, and all the southern peninsular territories that the Normans owned and from which they had begun their conquest of Sicily. And it was a pretty large quantity of dominions, because Sicily, first of all, was very rich, very powerful, very fertile. It had a lot of resources. It was in the center of the Mediterranean, was a great strategical point from which to expand. But the inland peninsular territories were actually also quite powerful. The Normans had the Duchy of Apulia, the Duchy of Calabria, and all the territories that lay today in the Italian regions of Campania and Abruzzo, which arrive actually up in the center. If you think about the region called the Marsica, it's actually quite close to Rome, and it's really important to think about the dimension of these dominions, which were pretty massive. Think about the Kingdom of Sicily was definitely more powerful and more resourceful than the Norman Kingdom of England of the time. And the most important aspect, probably even more of this, is that this conquest had been under the direction, let's say, at least spiritually speaking, but probably more politically speaking, of the Pope. The Pope had basically been able to keep the Normans under its power, to make them his vassals, and to expand the rule of the Church of Rome all over southern Italy, which was really a great achievement for the Church of Rome. The relationship between Rome and the Normans wasn't always perfect. There were even anti-popes, but this is a complicated story, and it has not completely to do with the conquest of Sicily itself. But let's say that it was a pretty great achievement for Christianity and for the Normans and for the Pope to have reconquered all these territories of southern Italy and Sicily and put them together. Obviously with great and long historical consequences, because the Kingdom of Sicily survived basically until the Italian unification in 1861. And we can also admire the level of power and of prestige that this kingdom achieved. Palermo in Sicily became the capital of the whole southern Italy, and in this sense the Normans exploited what the Arabs had already built, because as we said, Palermo had been the Arab capital of Sicily, and it kept developing this center with very clear in mind to continue on the Arab tradition of making of it a political and administrative center. And in this way, the legacy of the Arab bureaucracy and administration lived on after the 11th century into the Norman Kingdom. Now, I think maybe a bit clumsily I covered all the topics I needed to explain for today. I think these are actually interesting topics to talk about, and that people really rarely get to know in detail. I hope you enjoyed this video, and see you.